Today we have a wonderful presentation by Kevin Floyd, who is the curator at Chihuahuan Desert Garden at UTEP. And he's gonna be presenting on how to garden for birds. You know, Kevin does a wonderful job with all the presentations that he does, and we're lucky to have him. So please pay your undivided attention to him for the next however long it takes him. We don't care. And so it's all yours, Kevin. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Ignacio. Thanks, everybody. So anyway, like Ignacio said, I'm going to be talking about how to really create a yard that is great for birds, to be able to attract them and enjoy them. There we go. So the plan for today is to talk a little bit about why garden for birds, and then talk more about what birds need, some of the essential keys for creating a natural habitat that supports birds, and then just a few things about some resources that you might find helpful towards the end. And in full disclosure, this is essentially taken directly from this course done by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the one in the center there called Growing Wild, Gardening for Birds in Nature. I had signed up for this before, and preparing this talk was a good reason to actually go through and complete it. And I found it to be really helpful in terms of putting some of the thoughts that I had about best plants for birds and yard practices for birds, and really putting it into a nice sort of cohesive package. You will see it's $60, which is a little pricey, but if you subscribe to their mailing list, a lot of times they'll offer sales for half price or $20 off or something like that. So they're a good course. It's a mixture of short videos, text, some handouts, stuff like that. So anyway, a lot of what I'm saying is coming from them. So as them, they're the Cornell lab backing me up. Okay, so first question is why garden for birds? And I feel like I don't really need to belabor the point with a bunch of gardeners. Birds and wildlife in general add beauty and interest to a yard. This is a picture of a bee. You probably know I also do a lot of work with pollinators. So just having birds moving, the beauty they add, other wildlife, a lot of the practices that are helpful for gardening for birds are also helpful for gardening for all types of wildlife. Increasing natural habitat to support birds also helps support biodiversity. We see a lot of sprawl in El Paso. It's certainly, we're not unique in that case. We see sort of in the US and globally, there's a lot of natural habitat that's being converted into urban and suburban areas. And so by creating little pockets of natural habitat in your own yard, we can, I wouldn't say reverse it, but we can at least try to support a little bit of that biodiversity that might otherwise be lost. And again, certainly something I don't need to remind all of you, gardening promotes the well-being of the gardener, being outside, being active, the mental release of being out in nature is all very helpful. One other piece that I think is interesting that has been in the news recently is a lot of times bird feeders. So you can bring birds to the yard by using bird feeders, and I will talk about that. I have bird feeders. I think it's a great thing to do, but they do create congregations of birds, aggregations of birds. And as we've all learned from the last year and a half of COVID, the more people are close to each other, the more disease spreads. And the same is true for any wildlife. And so there's this mystery die-off going on the East Coast. You can see the little baby blue jay in the picture. And this is, they're not quite sure what's causing it. They've tested for salmonella. They've tested for some other things. The birds get lethargic and are dying. And so the recommendation in the East Coast, if you're in this area, is to take down your feeders because it's bringing birds in. And so if you're attracting a bunch of birds to your yard and one of them is diseased, it's more likely that it'll spread to other birds as well. We had an issue closer to home in the spring. That's the slide at the bottom. Salmonella is killing songbirds. This didn't really hit our region, but it was in Texas, and I think it was up into Colorado as well. But basically, anytime you have congregations of birds and you don't clean feeders well enough, you can spread disease pretty easily. And so if your yard is actually bird habitat, that creates a place where you're supporting birds, but you're not really clustering them into these big aggregations. So if you have, let's say, plants that produce seeds, you don't need to have a seed feeder up, and you can still help birds. It may not be the same congregation that we're used to seeing, but we're still helping them out. And then hopefully once things are under control or whatever that disease outbreak is stops, then people can put their feeders back up. Okay, so what do birds need? And I should say most of these pictures, unless there's a note, are ones that I've taken. I was trying to keep most of them pictures either from UTEP and the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens or from my yard, just to demonstrate some of the diversity you can see. This is an olive-sided flycatcher that I think this one might actually have been at a Scaraday Park, but that's essentially a backyard, not a wild area. So the quick piece, and we'll talk about all these in a little bit more detail. The first 5 things listed here are food. So birds need food: seeds and nuts, berries and fruit, nectar, flowers, and sap, insects and spiders, other invertebrates. These are all things for the birds to eat. They also need water, and they also need shelter and nesting areas. So if you provide, a good number of these, you should have a good number of birds in the yard. So starting with seeds and nuts, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. Seeds and nuts are high in proteins and fats. A lot of times they'll also stay on the plants throughout the fall and winter, so they provide food resources during a time of year that maybe there's not as much available for the birds. It's one of the challenges, I think, and we'll talk about this in a little bit also, is the best way to support birds is by leaving the spent flowers, the seed heads, on the plants instead of deadheading. I know a lot of times with gardening, we want to go through and deadhead everything because it looks nicer, and I know in some cases we deadhead because it promotes a second flowering or third flowering. So there's certainly cases where deadheading can be done, but wherever you can, just leaving the seed heads on will allow the birds to come in and forage on those at some point, especially throughout the winter. So sunflowers and grasses are really 2 of the best seed plants that we can grow in our area. There's, I forget the number, 4,000 plants native to the Chihuahuan Desert, plus all the exotics. So I'm not going to give you necessarily specific plant recommendations, but some of the types of plants that are really good for seed production are pines and conifers, oaks. There's a lot of oaks. I always see, a lot of birds around oaks collecting acorns. These pictures aren't ones that I've taken, but all these birds are in the El Paso area. It's a pine siskin, which is more of a winter bird for us on the sunflower. There are acorn woodpeckers up near the Coronado Country Club and down near the El Paso Country Club, basically where there's trees. There's a small population of them. And then painted buntings, the best spot to find them is in Rio Bosque Wetlands Park in the lower valley, but they're also in other kind of weedy areas because they eat grass seeds. So if you find, an irrigation canal or a drainage canal that has that they haven't mowed, that's another talk for another time. And they allow some of that weedy grass to set seed. You can find painted buntings there. Mesquites are a great plant. Saltbush, basically anything that flowers, that has a decent flower head that you can leave, will provide seeds for birds. The type of birds that you might find, sparrows are sort of the classic seed eater. A lot of them will forage on the ground, or they'll hop up into the grasses and pick the individual seeds out of it. Finches, siskins aren't like the siskin. Painted buntings, we also have blue grosbeaks and some other birds like that. Doves will often, they're more on the ground underneath plants like this. And then obviously woodpeckers will go for all of those. Even though I did mention that there are outbreaks that are connected or spread through having feeders, there's nothing wrong per se with feeders. Most of the time when we think about bird feeders, we're thinking about seed feeders. These are both from my yard. The 2 seeds that we feed at my house are black oil sunflower, which is the picture on my left, the picture with the house finch, the round ball. And then we feed thistle seed, also called Niger seed. and that really attracts a lot of the finches. We feed these two. There's other seeds out there. You can get safflower, you can get seed mixes. Those are okay, but they tend to attract more birds that I don't want to see. So things like house sparrows, which we get plenty of also, and pigeons and grackles and all the things. We get them in our yard, but in smaller numbers, because those types of birds can't really hang on these feeders the way that we have them. And so we're really targeting, finches for the most part, and then a few other birds that come along, and then whatever seed gets knocked on the ground, the other birds can go in and get. So seed feeders are great. That's a great way of supplementing. You just have to think about what you want to have in your yard and how much you want to clean up and how much you want to spend on seed. I will say Niger seed is pretty expensive. It's the more expensive of the seeds. The secret is Tractor Supply. They have sort of the best price on seeds. There does tend to be a bit more twigs and stuff like that in there, but you can just knock it out of the feeder when you refill. So next up are berries and fruits. These provide lots of fats and obviously sugars. And a lot of the plants, the time the fruits are mature is actually in the fall when migrating birds are coming through. That's not entirely true. We do have, plants that are fruiting right now. But sort of as a general rule of thumb, a lot of these are fruiting more towards the fall. The two that are pictured here, the one with the tiny purple berries is a condylia. That's the Condylia warnicii. And it's a spiny little shrub that I think it's a great plant because it produces flowers that a lot of, they're really nondescript flowers, but they're covered in pollinators, bees and wasps and flies. And then they produce these small purple berries, and there's mockingbirds, verdin, what else goes to them? Sparrows and finches. So even though they don't seem like a very big fruit, they're an important food source for our desert birds. The other picture with the redder flowers, that's a netleaf hackberry. And if you're familiar with the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens, that we have, I think it's 3 hackberries at the end near the Waco Pond. It's also when you're coming up past the guard station, the hackberries are the big trees that you see there. And they were covered in fruit, and we had good birds coming through most of the winter, up until the point that we were invaded by a couple hundred robins, and they were all over the hackberries. They ate all the hackberries. They pooped hackberries all over the garden, and then they were gone. And it was probably 3 days. They wiped out our hackberry supply and then moved on to someone else's yard to poop in. And that was probably January, maybe. So again, it's a really important food resource for our winter birds or migrating birds. Hackberries are really great plants. They're not very quick, fast growing, and they do take up a decent amount of space, but if you do have room for them, they're a really good plant to have. So some other examples, I mentioned the hackberry. We do have Mexican plum. The Texas persimmon is a favorite with some of the tanagers. Pistache, we have a Texas pistache, similar to the Chinese pistache that is more common in landscaping. Similar little small seeds and fruits. Any of the cactus fruits are popular. This is a northern mockingbird eating some of the tuna off of one of our prickly pears. And then the other picture, which looking at it on my screen anyway, just looks like a wall of brown with some black spots on it. That was one of the Washington palms in Leech Grove across from the museum at UTEP this past fall. And it was covered in birds eating all the palm fruit. The couple in the picture here, if you have good enough eyesight, are female western tanagers. But we had yellow warblers and blanking on it, yellow rump warblers, in addition to starlings and other birds. But I was really impressed. Western tanagers I don't see in big numbers usually, and there were 4 or 5 at a time on this palm. And I hadn't seen much eating the palm fruit before, so it was an interesting plant for that. Next up is nectar, flowers, and sap. Of course, the one that we always think about, which is in the next slide, are the hummingbirds that eat these. really anything that has tubular flowers. So desert willow, what a great plant, right? It's a native plant that blooms throughout pretty much the entire summer. After we have a lot of rains, it really just produces another flush of flowers, but on and off flowering throughout the summer. And it has those sort of big flowers that hummingbirds can stick their beaks into. Ocotillo, the middle picture, is another great plant for this. They tend to flower in the spring. It'll be interesting to see all of the Ocotillo are now these beautiful, lush green sticks after all the rain. I don't remember if they'll flower again or not, or if they really only flower in the spring. But there are just some studies recently. I just saw them on, I don't remember which Facebook group. I'm in too many native plant Facebook groups, but it was about how important Ocotillo flowering is for hummingbird migration, that the hummingbirds migrate through West Texas and the Southwest on their springward migration about the same time that the Ocotillos are flowering, and the Ocotillos provide a significant portion of the nectar that the hummingbirds use. The other picture is Salvia farinaceae, the mealy cup sage, another popular plant. And then some birds will eat flower buds, which could be a good or bad thing depending on your point of view. So again, any of the salvias, anything with tubular flowers, have really co-evolved with hummingbirds. Salvias, Ocotillo, the desert willows I mentioned, penstemons are another great flower. Anisocanthus, the hummingbird bush, there's a few varieties of that. The most common one I think that's around is I think it's called like the fire hummingbird bush. It's the quadrifolius, I forget the common name. They're blooming like crazy right now as well. Our summer resident hummingbird is the black-tinned hummingbird. That's the male up on the, sorry, let me get this working. So this is the male black-tinned hummingbird. A lot of the males have already started to migrate out. They come here, they breed, and then they head south. But we're actually getting into a really great time for hummingbirds because our sort of peak for hummingbird in both numbers and diversity is in the fall, because the rufous hummingbirds, calliope hummingbirds, broad-tailed hummingbirds all migrate through our area in basically like now. People are starting to see some of the male rufous hummingbirds show up. I know one person in town had a calliope, which is a small hummingbird with, the males have these really vibrant pink gorgets. So, and I mean, who doesn't love hummingbirds, right? So I know there's a lot of planting for hummingbirds. If you're lucky, you might also have orioles. Orioles are another flower nectar eater, so they're really attracted to Ocotillo. I was out at Waco Tanks about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, when the Ocotillos were still flowering, and there were Scott's orioles like this one in the slide, drinking the nectar from them. And then woodpeckers will also come in that have a sweet tooth. It's worth mentioning hummingbird feeders, just while I've got a captive audience. Hummingbird feeders, it's really easy to make the solution for it. It's 1 part white table sugar to 4 parts water. That just plain old, it seems wrong. We've been like conditioned so much that table sugar is bad for us. But it's what mimics the nectar in flowers the most. So just plain old table sugar, not honey, not raw sugar, not brown sugar, just plain old white sugar, 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. You need to heat them up to dissolve the sugar. Obviously cool it before using. I've seen some people talk about how they boil it for 20 minutes to sterilize the sugar, and that's great up until the point that the first bird sticks its bill in the sugar, and then it's contaminated anyway. So I tend not to worry too much about the sterility of the solution. I do tend to make up whatever the number is, like a container, right? Like a juice container, and leave it in the fridge and then change them frequently. That's probably the biggest piece, is that if you are going to do hummingbird feeders, you need to clean them, every couple days, perhaps every day during the hot weather. Some people have so many hummingbirds, they just have to clean them because they're getting wiped out by the number of hummingbirds that come through. There's an Audubon member who lives in the lower valley that is like, she goes through basically the amount of sugar water I go through in a week, she goes through daily, which of course I'm very jealous about. You do want to make sure that if you do a hummingbird feeder, it's something that's easy to clean because you have to clean it so often. When we first started doing bird feeding, had this, really pretty painted glass with a metal bottom, and it was just such a pain to clean that now we basically just use the generic plastic ones. You don't have to put dye in it. That's another, I guess, myth that isn't required. You don't need to put dye in the sugar water. Most of the hummingbird feeders are going to be red in some place, and so the hummingbirds are attracted to red, but you don't have to do that. And so they're great. I encourage hummingbird feeders just as long as you're cleaning them and doing a good job with that. Insects and spiders. So we're perhaps familiar with some birds that eat insects, but one of the things that I thought was interesting when I first learned it is that almost all songbirds will eat insects at some part of their life. So even things like sparrows and hummingbirds, hummingbirds eat a ton of insects, but they're ones that we don't provide for them. And if you think about it, if you're eating, nothing but nectar, where do you get your proteins from? And so the hummingbirds will catch gnats and mosquitoes and things like that. Sometimes if you see one kind of like checking out a leaf and doing kind of weird behavior, and you're like, that's a leaf, not a flower, dummy. They're probably looking for a spider or some little insect to pick off and eat. It's especially important for feeding the young. That's one of the times that birds really need a lot of protein. People have done some studies where they actually, monitor, they put a nest cam on some birds and see how many, what the birds are being fed. And this is on the East Coast with Carolina chickadees, but each baby chickadee eats something like 4,000 caterpillars in the 3 weeks between when it hatches and when it fledges. So it's just a huge amount of insects are required to feed the babies. When we think about what we need to do to provide for insects and spiders, we need to provide the plants that the insects and spiders eat. And so we usually, I strongly encourage native plants to feed the insects, and then those insects feed the birds. And I'll talk about it more in a little bit, but one of the main reasons is that native plants have co-evolved with the insects that are here, and so they provide insect food. And so when you're thinking about plants, if you have a plant that doesn't have any bug bites on it, that plant isn't contributing to the food web in the area. So you want something that's being eaten a bit. Obviously, there's somewhat of a fine line because we don't want to plant something and then it gets totally eaten and then it's dead. And what do you do next, right? So there is a balance, but that idea that, the native plants are feeding the insects, so we need to let some herbivory occur. And then sort of building on native plants feeding insects, a variety of native plants will feed a variety of insects, and a variety of insects will feed a variety of birds. So it's not just thinking about having one plant out there, but having a variety. The plant in the picture here is a honey mesquite. This is one of the best plants for basically feeding insects. They're often covered not covered, there's often insects present. And so when we start looking for birds like warblers and vireos and things like that during migration, mesquites are one of the hot spots for finding that type of bird. So examples is basically anything you don't treat with insects. But like I said, mesquites, oaks, and acacias seem to be particularly good for that. Some of the plants in the prunus genus, so plums and stuff like that. Warblers, so that's an orange crown warbler on the right, gleaning. So it's basically a behavior where they crawl, hop through the bushes looking for insects. So warblers and vireos, which do a similar behavior. Flycatchers like this western wood pewee, looking for bugs on the wing. Western kingbirds that a lot of people have in their yards. And then again, just about anything else. So hummingbirds will eat insects, sparrows eat insects. Just about everything needs insects. Along with insects or other tasty invertebrates, this is just kind of a catch-all for everything else that that birds might eat. So worms, slugs, snails, pill bugs. Most of these are animals that live either in the leaf litter or in the upper levels of the soil. The best way to support them is by leaving your leaves. So instead of raking everything up and either composting or throwing it away, be sure to leave some of the fall leaves or whatever leaves fall from the plants you have basically where they fall. And that creates that sort of decaying area where a lot of these insects or other invertebrates thrive. If you have space, you can go crazy with woody material, branches, tree trunks, sky's the limit. Of course, we're so dry for most of the time that wood doesn't decay very quickly for us. So it's a little bit different if you were talking about, the same thing in the Pacific Northwest or the East Coast. But the more you can leave, the more insects and invertebrates you support. Probably the classic picture of thinking about worms is, the robin pulling a worm out of the lawn. But it's also important for other warblers. The picture on I can show you the picture. This picture here, this is the hermit thrush. This is a common winter bird for us that basically stays in the ground, kicks leaves around, looking for invertebrates. And then wrens, this is a Buick's wren here. We also have house wrens and a few others. They're also kind of understory sulky birds that kick around the leaf litter and look for worms and centipedes and pill bugs and stuff like that. So that's sort of the cover of food. I guess it's not included here, but if you support all these birds, then you might also get raptors coming in. So if you have a good bird community from all of this, you might end up with a Cooper's hawk or a Swainson's hawk coming in and picking off a bird every now and again, which again is all part of the food chain. So moving away from food, one of the other requirements is water. I don't know if any of you recognize this. This is John Borea's backyard, which is definitely like dream water feature. So you can go as elaborate as you want to. He has this wonderful waterfall and pond. I have basically a saucer in my yard. That's my water feature. So anything can work. Moving water does tend to attract more birds. It can be something as fancy as a waterfall like this, or it can be a milk jug that you poke a hole in and let it drip slowly, hang it above a saucer of water, or any sort of small fountain. One big concern with any sort of water feature is that you do need to clean it frequently, partly for disease spread, also to control algae growth. But then, speaking as someone who reacts to mosquito bites and am itchy for a week, you want to be sure to control your mosquitoes. So if you have standing water, mosquitoes can lay eggs and produce new mosquitoes in it's like 2 or 3 days. So if you don't change your water very frequently, or have moving water, then it is potentially a mosquito breeding ground. Shallow water is typically best. Most birds don't like to go diving when they take their baths. They want to stand in the water and kind of splash around. So this picture up here, this is what we call the bird fountain at the Centennial Gardens. This is that copper fountain that has the 3 levels, has some nice shallow areas. This is a warbling vireo that was drinking on it. And then these are the saucers I've got in my yard. So it attracted a dark-eyed junco, Inca doves, and then this is a starling, but it was just going to town. That's sort of the action shot with the water splashed all over the place. And especially, I mean, I think probably as much or more so for us because we're in the desert, water features really bring in the birds. The food is great, but a lot of times they can find food other places, but finding water other places might be a bigger challenge for them. So if you really want to attract a lot of birds, a water feature is the way to go. And then the last thing that birds need is shelter and nesting spots. This is a black-chinned hummingbird that was nesting actually just outside my office here at UTEP a couple years ago. Was close enough. It was basically eye level, just on a tree, so I was able to watch it as it raised its babies. When you think about shelter, I mean, we've all been experiencing those big storms that are coming through with all the wind and rain. So you want branches and foliage. So evergreens are really good for that. Anything that basically can give them a place to tuck in that they're going to be protected. Nesting sites, a lot of birds do nest on the ground, so thinking about having shrubs or that brushy pile that they can nest in. Some are in trees, some are in cavities. So like think about a woodpecker pecking a hole in a tree and living in there. Some live under ledges, like some of the swallows and some of the wrens. Typically, trees and shrubs provide the best cover just because they're the biggest. The nesting material that birds use is dried grass, twigs, moss, spider webs, animal fur. But one thing that I think a lot of people have this, desire to do good for the birds and leave out yarn or string, and that can actually get tangled around the legs of the birds and can cause the birds to need like their leg amputated. Some people put dryer lint out, but that can have, if you use dryer sheets, that's going to have like weird chemicals in it. Pet fur, I've seen that as a common thing too, like brush your dog and just leave the fur out there for the birds. That's not bad unless you're using some sort of anti-flea or anti-tick. Was it Advantage, I think is the common one, where you put the drop on the back of their neck and it sort of spreads throughout their fur. So if you're basically treating your animal with any sort of pesticide, you want to make sure not to use those. That fur, leave that out for the birds. I have to say, like around here, I don't think birdhouses are really worth it. You'll probably be providing nests for European starlings and house sparrows, both of which are invasive species. So the things that really go to bird houses are like bluebirds and swallows, and we don't have nesting bluebirds in the summer. Our bluebirds are here in the winter. Swallows have plenty of other spots. But if you do try to do a bird house, you have to design it the right way. There's actually resources out there of like how big the opening needs to be, because if it's too big, then starlings get in. If it's too small, then the other birds don't get in. But they have to be cleaned often as well. Birds will actually, the parents will take what are called fecal sacs. So the baby birds produce their poop in a little sack, and then the parents carry it away. So the nest isn't necessarily that bad, but it does kind of build up eventually. So it needs to be cleaned out. So like I said, I personally don't think it's worth it, but if you're doing maybe, you have kids or grandkids and you want to, see the miracle of life, you could do that. Just be aware that it's a responsibility too. Okay, so to recap, you need food for the birds, you need water, you need shelter. And so I wanted to just take a second to let everybody think, like, what are the things that you're currently providing? Are there areas that you're already doing a good job with? Or what do you want to add? So like for me personally, we're still trying to add more native plants to our yard, more variety of plants. But I really want to add a water feature. That's the high on my list, is some sort of moving water. I've been wanting to do it for a couple of years and just haven't pulled it off. So think about it, put it in the chat if it's something you want to share. Save it for the end, or if anyone has a pressing need to share, feel free to bring it up now. All right, so those are some of the more specifics. And so next, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the more general principles, the keys for gardening for birds. And those are to include native plants, to invite biodiversity, to create vertical diversity, embrace messiness, offer year-round abundance, and to keep the bird visitors safe. So native plants, I don't know if you've all talked about what makes a plant native or non-native. That's again a whole discussion. When we're thinking about it in this context, we usually mean a native plant is something that was found in an area prior to European settlement. Of course, native groups move plants around as well. So this is just kind of a rule of thumb. There isn't really, a set piece, but the idea is that a native plant has been in that area long enough that it has co-evolved relationships with other plants and animals in that area. And so it's a plant that, that the other animals recognize, I guess is one way to look at it. So it's something that they can recognize as food, or they can recognize as a resource in some way. When you are planting native plants, you're supporting the ecosystem, you're supporting that food web. So a lot of times the non-native plants that are brought into yards and into nurseries, one of the reasons that people like them is that they don't have pests. So they don't have insects that eat them because they're from Asia, or they're from Europe, and so, or from Africa. And the pests that evolve with those plants isn't here. And so you bring that plant in, it doesn't get eaten, it's beautiful, life is great, except then you think, wait, why don't I have birds in my yard? Or where are the pollinators? And it could just be that those are foreign plants. The wildlife that's here just doesn't know what to do with it. So using native plants helps to maintain that connection. That being said, not every plant needs to be native, right? So there are beautiful plants. This is a red lantana. It's visited by hummingbirds and bees and butterflies, roses. There are plenty of very attractive and good non-native plants. Some of the studies, like the one I mentioned with the chickadees feeding 3,000 caterpillars, they look at different yards and basically measure the success of the nests in yards with different amounts of native plants. And they found that, up to about 30% non-native plants, no difference. So, if you have zero non-native versus 30% non-native, the birds do fine. It's when you start getting up to like 50% non-native, 70% non-native that you start to see a decline in the support for birds and other wildlife. So by all means, keep your roses, keep the dahlias, keep the non-native ornamentals, but work towards getting, if something dies and you need to replace it, consider native plants in its place. Thinking about biodiversity again, the more diversity you have, the more diversity of plants you have, the more types of insects and other invertebrates will eat that. The more nesting habitat there is, the more roosting location there is, the more types of insects that can be supported. This middle picture here, this is a hummingbird called a Gulf frittery, and it's pretty unusual. We saw this is from the garden last year, and actually when I was out there this morning with Barb, saw one fly by, the first one I'd seen this year. So I figure I called it in by putting this picture into the presentation. But again, moving away from monocultures is the idea here. And of course, the biggest monoculture that most of us have in their yard, myself included, is your lawn. And so you can certainly, my lawn is not a monoculture. I've got plenty of weeds that provide some diversity, but what we typically think of, lawns don't provide a lot of ecosystem services, a lot of support for wildlife. So trying to replace the lawn with native plants is good. And I just included this picture. This is from a xeriscape guide from New Mexico. But just that idea that you don't have to get rid of lawn. The message isn't rip out all lawn is horrible. It's great to have a lawn if you've got, pets, or you've got, kids or grandkids, or you want to hang out and barbecue. Like, the message isn't get rid of lawns. It's just use the amount of lawn that you need to, because it's takes a lot of water, typically, time, potentially chemicals, and it doesn't support the wildlife the way that you might otherwise want. Vertical diversity, all we mean by this is think about having, ground covers and shrubs. This is a iodine bush, some of the conoclinium, some shrubs like this olive, the wolfberry, and some trees. We've got hackberry here in the back. I don't know if you can squint enough. There's probably a mockingbird sitting on top of it. So again, we're just thinking in terms of diversity. If you have nothing but low plants, then you don't have that place for the birds to shelter in. If you have nothing but trees, you probably don't have as much food or shelter for some of the birds at the lower levels. So the more variety you can produce, the better resources you'll have typically. Embracing the messiness. So I mentioned this with seed heads. Leave the seed heads if you can. Everybody's probably enjoyed all the leucophyllum, all the Texas Ranger, Texas sage that's been blooming lately. Please don't prune them into round spheres or cubes. natural plants provide more foraging areas and more shelter. So leaving plants in their natural state as much as possible, leaving flower heads, leaving the leaves. Feel free to tell whoever you want in the fall when they tell you to go rake up your yard, tell them, no, I'm supporting birds and soil. I have Kevin's full support on this. I tell them to email me. I'll write up an email, tell them why to leave the leaves. If you do have space that you can leave a snag, so a dead tree, obviously not something that's going to fall on your house, but if you have something where you can leave a stump, that can be used by cavity nesters, or again, can support other types of invertebrates. So basically, try to move away from manicured as much as you can. Year-round abundance. So this is my attempt at showing some of the seasons. So this is, early spring, winter with poppies and spectacle pods at the garden. So having plants that are going to provide resources early in the spring. This is a false indigo bush, one of my favorites, that blooms sort of Mayish, so mid to late spring. This is a pine siskin on some of those sunflower seed heads, so providing that food in the fall. And then this is what is this? It's not the serviceberry, mahogany. Blanking on which one this is, but you can see there's little red berries in there. So providing food, that's plants that are going to provide food throughout the entire year. So trying not to get too focused on, spring flowers or summer flowers, but really thinking about the entire year. So after you've done all of this and you've attracted all these birds to your yard, you want to make sure to keep them safe. So one of the things you can do is try to avoid window collisions. A couple things you can do for this is, it seems sort of counterintuitive, but keeping bird feeders close to the house actually helps, because it's close enough that the birds can't really get up a head of steam as they're flying off. So the idea is, if the birds are foraging and then a hawk comes through and they all flush, if they have enough distance, they build up that head of steam, really slam into your window. If it's only 3 feet away, they might hit it, but they'll bounce off and not typically not be going fast enough to get seriously injured. The other thing you can do, especially if you have areas that you do see a lot of bird collisions, is put on some window treatments. The issue with windows is that they reflect the nature that's around them. So birds basically see the tree that's reflecting in there, they think that's a normal tree and they fly towards it. And so putting on window treatments helps to break up that image. And so you can get these little dots that apply to the window. You can do vertical screening. You've probably all seen the silhouette of a hawk, and you slap that in the middle. That doesn't really do anything, apparently. Most of the studies show that it needs to be pretty tightly placed. But some of these now are starting to be UV reflective, and so they don't really show up to our eye, but because birds can see in the UV spectrum, it reflects that more so. And so it's not necessarily a visual impact. I mentioned this before, so I won't belabor it, but clean everything. Again, you don't want to attract disease. Turn off your outside lights. This is a big issue, particularly for migrating birds. There's a campaign called Lights Out Texas. There's Lights Out Philly. There's some other places, but basically this idea that when birds are migrating, a lot of birds migrate at night. And when they see all the lights from cities, they get disoriented. They don't navigate properly. They land in the wrong place. And so this Lights Out Texas campaign is a campaign to try to get everybody, but especially, big, tall buildings downtown, to turn their lights off during these periods at night to try to help the birds with migration. One of the other big issues is cats. So if you've attracted all these wonderful birds to your yard and then your cat eats them all, not really doing a good thing. So keeping your cats inside is the safest option. If you do want to let your cat outside, we have a cat, we let it outside in the morning when we're out gardening, and then in the evening when we're at home doing stuff. And so it's basically supervised outside time. Our ultimate goal is to build a catio, which is this thing here. It's just an enclosed area outside so that your cat is safe, but still gets to enjoy the outside. You can also put collars on them. Cats are really good hunters, so just putting a bell on the collar doesn't really do much. I just love the expression of this cat, because this cat is really describing how it really feels about wearing a clown collar, but The idea is partly that it makes noise, but also it's a very bright thing. So that cat trying to sneak up on a bird is not going to do very well. So if you do have outside cats and you really, have to leave them outside, or maybe you convince your neighbors that have outside cats to give them clown collars, these apparently work pretty well. And just to show you, like, the reason that this matters, this is a study looking at bird mortality from anthropogenic or human-caused factors in the U.S. And the estimate is that cats kill about 2.5 billion birds a year in the U.S. So really, really a significant problem. And we usually think about, if you're a homeowner and you have a cat that is outside and, it kills one bird every other day or one a week, multiply that times all of the cats that are in the US, and it has a significant impact. And more so than the cats that homeowners have are all of the feral cats. We don't really have as much of a sense of what's going on there. So trying to keep cats away from birds is a really important part. And then the building collision, that idea of turning off your lights or window screening, that's half a billion birds killed by that. Some of the other things that are out there, we don't want to poison them. We want to be careful with electric lines. You might have heard about wind turbines, which do cause mortality, but it's relatively small compared to some of these other pieces. So the recap: native plants, biodiversity, vertical biodiversity, let the yard be messy, think about year-round support for the birds, and then keep the visitors safe. And then wrapping up real quickly, and then hopefully there'll be enough time for questions. So I'm guessing, I know that there are plenty of master gardeners who are also, bird watchers and know what's going on. But if you're fairly new to this and you're thinking, great, I brought all these birds in and all I'm like, oh, it's a brown bird. And you really want to know more about it. The app that I recommend to people the most is by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, called the Merlin app. It's a free app. And what's really great about it is, well, first that it's free, but it will help you identify birds by asking you these questions. So if you see something and you want to know what it is, the first question it asks you for date and time, because that's really important. Is it a bird that is found in El Paso or not? And then it asks you a rough size. So is it a sparrow? Is it a crow? Is it a goose? Is it somewhere in between? What are some of the primary colors that you see? And then what was it doing? Was it eating out a feeder, or was it soaring, or was it in the bushes? And then you put that in, and it basically will go through sightings of birds that have been reported and try to match your description to a list of birds. So now, instead of having to go through an entire field guide of 400 species of birds, it gives you 3 options or 10 options to look through. They just updated it to where it's supposed to work for identifying bird calls. I haven't tried that out yet, but I've heard it's pretty good. So if you hear a bird, you can also try to identify it. It can do photos. If you have a picture of a bird, it can do reverse image analysis to try to identify it. So it's one of the best ways, sort of early, to figure it out. We do have an Audubon Facebook group. So if you have questions and you're a Facebook user, you can join the group and post questions and pictures, and we'll try to help you identify them. We're a relatively small group. There's also Birding New Mexico, which is a larger one. So if you see something and want an answer, that's another group you can try out. I basically consider ourselves New Mexico, even though obviously we're not. Our birds are a lot more similar to New Mexico than they are to most of Texas. If you're trying to think about which plants, so I've given you some general categories. If you're trying to think about which ones to do in particular, Audubon has this website. I don't actually know what the URL is. If you search for native plants in Audubon, it'll come up. But you can put in your zip code, you can put in your email address, but I tried it without and it works okay. And then it generates a list of plants. For our region, it only had 38. But it's pretty cool. It'll tell you the plant. It'll give you a description, what the attributes are, what some of the birds are that might be attracted. You can sort it by the type of plant, the type of resources. So if you're just thinking I've got nectar down, but I need seed plants, you can click on that and focus on seed plants. You can focus on the type of bird if you want to be a bird snob and only attract sparrows and not tanagers or what have you. I will say their idea of native plant is somewhat suspect. This is American elm is not a plant that's native to our region, but so take it with a grain of salt. But I was scrolling down, and they do have creosote and desert willow were on the list, so pretty cool options for that. So now you know what plants you want to do. How do you get them? We have a couple good local nurseries, Sierra Vista, Eastside Discount, for native plants. Most of the big box stores, Lowe's and Home Depot, they don't have a ton of native plants. If they do have something sold as a native plant, it's native to East Texas or something like that. You can try growing your own. You're all master gardeners, right? You should be able to handle that. So you can grow your own. You can get cuttings, seeds, transplants from friends. Somebody has a bunch of penstemon, go grab a handful of seed and throw them in your yard. And then the other exciting thing, I'm happy to announce that we're going to do a fall plant sale this year. It's tentatively scheduled for October 9th. I'll be bugging everybody about volunteering, probably at the beginning of September, if all goes well. And as I'm sure all of you know, fall is the best time in our region to plant trees and shrubs. So if you're inspired by this to plant a mesquite or plant a desert willow, fall is going to be a great time to plant because it gives the plants a little bit of warmth to get established, but we're not putting them in the ground and getting them cooked by 110-degree weather right away. So keep your eyes open for that. So to recap, birds need food, seeds and nuts, berries and fruit, nectar, flowers and sap, insects and other invertebrates. They need water, they need shelter and nesting spots. As you're building all of this, you want to include native plants, you want to have biodiversity, you want to have vertical diversity, you want to embrace that messy yard, you want to provide year-round abundance, and you want to keep those birds safe once they're in your yard. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take any questions, comments, favorite plants, bird identification, whatever you want.
Do you know anything about the solar water feeder?
A little bit, yes. So they're basically little pumps with a fountain attached that have they're solar powered instead of having to run electrical to them. They seem great. I know some people can set up some really cool recirculating features with solar fountains, or even just having one in a bird bath. So I think they're great. Any sort of movement's going to help bring the birds in. I don't know enough about them to recommend a particular model or anything. I think you can get them that are sort of all one unit, but you can also just get like a solar fountain that basically drops into an existing water body. I've also seen, I think they call them wigglers, that basically is just a little vibrating something that goes in the water bath and just creates ripples. Because again, they're attracted to the movement of the water. But you want to make sure that whatever you make, it's not too hard to clean, because you do want to be sure to clean them pretty often. I see somebody already had a Rufus hummingbird at their house. I'm jealous. We have not had ours yet.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm happy to report that we do have the hummingbirds coming around the Escarate garden. We have a lot of native plants that are blooming like crazy right now. The hummingbirds especially love the ruby red sage. They hover around that one a lot, and we have the hummingbird feeders. They fight for territory. We're seeing lots of butterflies and bees. So I think we have the right combination and we just created a water feature that'll be operational here in the next week or so.
Excellent.
So one of these days, come by and take a look at what we've done.
Yeah, every time I drive past, I'm like, man, I really need to visit the gardens. But
yeah, well, all of them look beautiful thanks to the hard work that everybody in the association does, and we're very proud of everything we do.
There's a couple questions that popped up. One is about a good solution for cleaning bird feeders. The recommendation is typically soapy water and then a 10% bleach soak for, I think, about 10 minutes. So 10% bleach is the miracle disinfectant. So you can soak it in bleach, rinse it well, let it dry before you use it. What I've done is I have 2 feeders, and so I'm able to have one that's cleaned and ready to go and then basically swap it out. We also, certainly during the summer, I think if you just clean it with soapy water and get all the poop off of it, you can leave it out in the sun for a while, and that also should disinfect just about anything. So soapy water, 10% bleach is the best. And there's a question about pigeons in the area. Yes, I guess. There's lots of them. They're pretty, as annoying as they can be. I don't blame them. They did not ask to be brought to the US. If they start to become a pest, like there's a house down the street from us that feeds, I think it's mostly feral cats, but they leave out a bunch of cat food and the pigeons get all the cat food. So if you don't want pigeons or really any pest, you have to think about what's attracting them. You're never going to get rid of all of them. But if you have sort of open food out, you're going to get more pigeons. Like we rarely get pigeons at our house, and we're maybe, I don't know, 3-5 houses down from the one that has all the pigeons. So maybe that's why. Maybe all the pigeons are there, so they don't come up to our house. But it's just kind of thinking about what do they want. They nest on ledges. Their native range in Europe and Asia. They nest on the side of cliffs. And so all of the buildings, like downtown buildings and things like that have ledges, they love that. So again, if you have a house with ledges, you can see, and they're nesting there, you can see about like the spikes you can put in there, attach stuff like that. But they're kind of a mess, but they're really pretty. So if you take a look at them, they are pretty cool birds. All right, bye everybody. Thanks for having me. I hope to see you at the fall plant sale.